Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Mallory Newell, Vice President with Ipsos Public Polling Team. Mallory, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you, James. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. It's a pleasure to be back with you with my colleagues Bernard Mendez and Dan O'Leary. Hope everyone is enjoying their summer and enjoying what's left of it now that we're in August. We are excited to unpack some of the latest Ipsos public opinion data and what it all means. As per usual, these webinars are all based on the wealth of public-facing data that Ipsos has. All of these polls that we'll reference today you can find on the Ipsos website. And as James alluded to, we're happy to take questions if time permits at the end of the webinar. So we've got a lot to cover today. Really kind of focusing in on the key issues of the day and the things that people are talking about. So we'll spend some time up front kind of talking about what the main issues are, looking at the impact on President Trump's approval rating. We'll pivot to some data that we have on the one big beautiful bill now that it is law, and also look at Americans' current perceptions of the economy and spotlight some recent research that we did on the future of the American dream, which I think ties nicely to some of these topics that we're talking about today. Finally, we've got some fresh data on immigration and then on public health. So before we dive into our first topic, again, this webinar, Knowing the New America, I just wanted to offer some context for folks of why it's important to sort of listen and learn and understand the key issues of today, right? I think it's very clear that for researchers and for brands alike, it is really critical right now to make sure that we all truly understand the American public, attitudes toward key issues, thoughts, sentiments, what motivates them, what concerns them. And then for brands, really, it's also a question of kind of how we navigate this current sort of hyperpolarized, very sort of diminished levels of institutional and interpersonal trust, how we navigate that landscape that can be really fraught with potential landmines at times. So just wanted to offer that up as some kind of context for all of the data that we'll be exploring today. Now, without further ado, let's dive into our first topic here. So looking at the main issue today, I think we unpacked this a little bit in June. If you go to the next slide, we see that there continues to be sort of three kind of top tier issues, right? That's political extremism or threats to democracy. That's the line in green, the economy in red, and then immigration is sort of a second tier issue. Now, as we mentioned in June, the economy and political extremism often kind of trade places or at times are sort of really close together as a single top tier issue. And what we've seen now in the past few months is that political extremism or threats to democracy has really kind of overtaken the economy as the main issue for now. So in other words, I think the issue landscape has shifted from one that is solely focused on the economy. And just a little bit of history here. If you think about the 2024 presidential election, the economy was an issue that President Trump, then candidate Donald Trump, was seen as having an advantage on over Vice President Kamala Harris. And we know from our research done at Ipsos that the candidate that is seen as having an advantage on the main issue, the vast majority of the time has an advantage heading into an election. And that's how it played out in 2024. But now we're kind of in a place where we've moved from the economy as the main issue, which is something that President Trump and Republicans have continued to hold an advantage on, to one where both parties have sort of roughly equal footing. There's not really one particular political party that's seen as doing better on political extremism or threats to democracy. But I think it is noteworthy that this issue does tend to kind of spike over time. And so as you can see on this slide, right, Republicans retain an advantage on who does a better job when it comes to the US economy, and when it comes to immigration. But this D+2 that you see on the left side of your screen is sort of within the margin of error, right? Both parties are seen as relatively equal. And so why is this shift important, right? I think it's certainly too early. I hope it's too early to start talking about 2026 and the midterm elections. But we can imagine how this could play out in 2026. I think if political extremism and threats to democracy continues to be seen as the main issue facing the country and does start to kind of eclipse the economy more regularly, is it going to be successful for Democrats to use this concern as sort of a rallying cry for their base, right? Republicans have kind of been a little bit more satisfied with the direction of the economy. So do they start to sort of shift their area of focus to immigration to sort of shore up that advantage, or focus more on threats to democracy? I think that remains to be seen. And if you go to the next slide, I love this graphic, but really what this is showing here is the size of the box for each issue is relative to the advantage that each party has. So take the teal box, for example, political extremism and threats to democracy. You see that Democrats, those that identify as Democrats, are more likely to select threats to democracy as the main issue that they are concerned about. Whereas immigration, look at the dark blue box on the right, Republicans are more likely to cite that as the main issue. And so I think it is worth noting that the shift in the main issue right now is being driven primarily by Democrats. Nearly half have selected political extremism as their top issue. So I think what we're seeing here in this sort of current time frame where we move from the economy as kind of the single main issue to more of a focus on political extremism and threats to democracy, it's really people from one side of the political aisle kind of coalescing around one specific issue that matters to them. On the other hand, Republicans who have grown more confident in the economy since President Trump was elected and inaugurated have kind of diversified their concerns a little bit. So a little bit of concern into political extremism, also immigration, also the economy, also morality. So I think as things kind of continue to fluctuate in this current landscape, it's just worth keeping an eye on what the main issue is and really the root causes of that. Now I'll turn it over to Bernard. He's going to talk a little bit about President Trump himself, where he's sitting today, as well as One Big Beautiful Bill. Bernard.
Thanks, Mallory. Yeah, hi everyone, glad to be here. So on the next slide, I think to sort of kick off our discussion of Trump's approval rating, I think it's worth remembering that we sort of live in a different reality compared to the reality we have lived in the past when it comes to presidential approval. So this graph shows sort of the highest approval ratings and lowest approval ratings these presidents have historically gotten. And so if you look at sort of the historical presidents before Trump and Biden, there's a pretty large range of sort of the possible approval ratings these presidents could get. They could get really high approval ratings. They could also get really low approval ratings. But when we kind of isolate it to just Trump's first term, Biden's term, we see that the range of sort of possible outcomes when it comes to approval ratings is a lot lower. This is mostly a byproduct of sort of the high levels of polarization we are in right now, but also the sort of high level of loyalty Democrats and Republicans have to their candidate. So for example, Trump might have a very loyal base, but Democrats might not approve of how he's handling the presidency, which sort of gives him a very low ceiling, but also high floor when it comes to presidential approval. This also held true for Biden in the reverse for a big chunk of his presidency. Biden saw a pretty significant spike in approval at the start of his presidency due to his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. But once that sort of receded from the public's mind, he sort of hovered around the same range Trump hovered at in his first term, sort of between the sort of high 30s, mid 40s, high 40s% range. And so that's just worth keeping in mind that, there's a new standard to presidential approval rating. What is good, quote unquote good, now is different from what was good in the past. I think the next slide, if we use that to sort of frame how we think about Trump's approval rating these days, we see that Trump right now is sort of falling sort of right in the middle of where that possible range of outcomes is for presidents when it comes to their approval rating. Right now, it sort of depends on exactly where you look, but he's sort of in that sort of mid 40% range. So this graph is showing 3 different averages of Trump's approval rating from 3 different polling outlets. Pretty much, they all take different averages of all the polls in the marketplace and weight different polls differently. So the exact number of Trump's approval rating kind of depends on exactly where you look. But the story is pretty consistent throughout all these 3 different averages. They're all telling the same story. And that is Trump started out his presidency with a very high approval rating. That 52% average approval rating that Trump notched at the start of his term is actually the highest Trump has ever received on approval ratings, including his first term. But after that, he saw a pretty steep decline over his first 100 days, a very fast decline, faster than normal, but has sort of hovered around that mark since then. He saw a slight increase, slight decrease, but really what we've seen is that it's pretty steady between his 100-day mark and now. And so again, when we use this sort of historical frame, or at least the frame of how we view presidential approval now, this, although historically low, is pretty much a good place for the president. Being above 40% means that he's held on to his base and then some. I think a worrying sign for the president would be dipping below 40%. More positive signs for the president would be kind of reaching into that upper 40% range. But this sort of mid 40% range is a good sign for the president, solid sign. He could do better, he could be doing worse. And so that is how we're looking at presidential approval right now. But on the next slide, we'll get into sort of the big, beautiful bill. And so to kick off our conversation about this, I think it's important to talk about why we're talking about the One Big Beautiful Bill now. Because the bill was passed around a month ago on July 4th, and it is law now. So why are we still talking about it? One, because it's a very big, significant bill, one of the key landmark pieces of legislation of the second Trump administration, but also because we think the battle over the One Big Beautiful Bill isn't necessarily over. And by that we mean, although it is signed into law, although it is law now, especially as we head into the 2026 midterm season, we're likely to see a lot of the things inside the bill continue to be talked about, continue to be debated about, in part because there's so much in the bill that gives a lot of ammunition for both sides when it comes to making their case in 2026. So on the next slide, again, to sort of frame our discussion of the One Big Beautiful Bill, when we look at how familiar or how much Americans have heard about the bill, we see that familiarity is pretty low. I think I'll importantly note that this was conducted in early June. The bill was signed into law in early July. And this was sort of near the peak of when the Big Beautiful Bill was being talked about in the news. But that is to say that the number may have shifted a bit since then. But I think most importantly, it shows that, to start especially, Americans weren't particularly familiar with the bill. Very few heard a great deal about it. Few heard, a plurality heard a little about it. There are slight differences across party, but really it shows that there isn't a whole lot of familiarity with the bill. And we'll dig into this in a bit, but something our colleague Cliff Young wrote about is that this low familiarity with the bill combined with the sort of ambiguousness in how the bill was titled, right? One Big Beautiful Bill doesn't really reference anything inside the bill, has given a lot of room for sort of detractors and proponents to sort of frame the bill depending on which parts of the bill they focus on and which parts are popular, which parts are unpopular. So on the next slide, you sort of see the effects of this, where again, Americans are very divided overall in the Big Beautiful Bill, but Americans at around a 2-to-1 ratio oppose the bill over support this bill. I think there are 2 really interesting things that this graph shows. One is that, again, Americans at a 2-to-1 ratio oppose this bill as opposed to support this bill. And there are a lot of reasons for this, but one is that with big pieces of legislation such as this, they often get defined by their weakest link as opposed to their stronger links, right? So when you look at how Americans view the bill at a top line level, it might be lower than how they view, some of the more popular aspects of the bill because it contains some things that Americans aren't too favorable of. The other interesting part of this chart, the chart before, is that there are a lot of Americans that select no opinion. And that is, one, kind of a reflection of the low familiarity Americans have with the bill, but I think is also a reflection of how divided and conflicted, especially Republicans, are when it comes to this bill. Kind of representing, that there are a lot of pieces of this bill that are very popular. There are a lot of pieces that are unpopular. So when you ask about this bill at a top line level, you get results that are a bit divided. And a lot of Americans are unsure exactly how to feel about this bill. So on the next slide, we sort of see a good example of how why this has happened. Again, there are some aspects of this bill that are actually very popular, right? So increasing the annual child tax credit, eliminating taxes on tips have bipartisan support, which is pretty rare for economic policy these days. Whereas things like reducing federal funding for food assistance, refilling student loans are a bit more divisive or unpopular. I think we'll see these in the next two slides, but sort of the common theme throughout, what is unpopular versus what is popular in this bill is sort of the idea of taking versus giving back. Things that quote unquote give to Americans, like tax credits, eliminating taxes on tips, are very popular. Things that are seen as sort of taking away, like taking away federal funding for food assistance, are a bit less popular. So that is a common thing that kind of shines through, which parts of the bill are popular, which parts are not. And the next slide is a good example of that with an additional layer. So when we ask about the extension of 2017 federal tax cuts, we see that when we ask this in general, not including anything shown in this graph, but just sort of broadly, around half of Americans support it, a quarter oppose it, a quarter don't know, but when you break it out into the groups that are on the receiving end of these tax extensions, the results are a bit different. So this graph kind of makes more sense when you think about it for a second, but unsurprisingly, Americans are broadly in favor of extending the tax cuts for individuals that make under $100,000 a year, or couples that make under $200,000 a year. Essentially, Americans really like the tax cuts for themselves, but when it comes to people that make more income or business corporations, support declines pretty significantly. And that is, again, not only a reflection of the fact that, parts of the bill that are seen as, quote unquote, giving to Americans as opposed to taking away are very popular, but also the fact that Americans are very distrustful of people that make a lot of money in business corporations. And so when we look at the top line level of how Americans feel about the federal income taxes, that both of these things are kind of nested in there, both, their desire for tax cuts, presumably for themselves, versus their distrust of tax cuts for wealthier people or business corporations. On the next slide, we'll talk a bit about Medicaid. Pretty much, again, when we ask about the addition of work requirements for Medicaid in general, not including any of this language, just asking about the addition of more work requirements for Medicaid, we see that around half of Americans support that. But when we ask Americans about whether they think the fact that around 8 million people are estimated to lose Medicaid health insurance as a result of the bill's changes, support declines significantly. But again, it also depends on how you frame it, right? So if we just tell Americans that the bill will result in 8 million people losing Medicaid health, 63% say that's unacceptable. But when we ask the question and sort of phrase it when it comes to, the fact that it is the work requirements, as well as, penalties for states that pay for undocumented immigrants to access Medicaid, the story is a lot more conflicted. There's a lot fewer Americans that say it's unacceptable, more that say that it's acceptable, also slightly more that say that they have no opinion. So again, just kind of reflecting the fact that, there is a lot of division when it comes to this bill, and a lot depends on how the bill is framed. And again, the reason why we're talking about this bill now, a month after it passed, is broadly because it's interesting, but also because we think the battle over the bill isn't over. We're likely to hear more about the One Big Beautiful bill, especially heading into the 2026 midterms. Something that Cliff Young again wrote about is that we might not hear both sides of the political spectrum mention the name One Big Beautiful bill. For Republicans, that might be because at a top line level, the bill is unpopular. But for Democrats, we might not hear them talk as much about the bill as well, because if Democrats or people that are listening to Democrats are reminded of the more popular aspects of the bill, they might view the bill a bit more favorably if they become more familiar with those popular aspects of the bill. So I think expect to hear more about the bill, even if you don't hear the term one big beautiful bill. You might hear a lot about the components of the bill, and depending on where you're looking, either the more popular or unpopular aspects of the bill. But that said, don't expect the battle over the one big beautiful bill, so to speak, to be ending soon. But with that said, I'll hand things over to Dan, who's going to talk a bit about the economy. Dan, over to you.
Thanks, Bernard. So yeah, we're gonna dive into the economy now. We're gonna look at measures like consumer confidence. And we'll see how that varies based on demographics like age and parental status. We'll consider the factors that are impacting economic perspectives, focusing on tariffs in particular, and then we're gonna briefly explore how that ties into perspectives on the American dream more broadly. So focusing in on consumer confidence to start, after steadily declining from January through May of this year, we first saw consumer confidence tick upward in June, and then it remained stable from month to month for the first time this year from June to July. But despite this slight rebound and then now stabilization, it is important to point out that this is 2 points lower than this time last year. So it's down year over year. And the overall consumer confidence index that we're highlighting on this chart, it's made up of sub-indices like the expectations index, which if you hadn't guessed is about economic expectations that people have. And that's similarly down year over year, although it's stable month to month. We're just in a period where the macroeconomic environment, the global environment, the zeitgeist, whatever you want to call it, it's somewhat volatile. And there are a lot of, there are factors like tariffs, which we'll talk about in a minute. There are global conflicts or the threat of global conflict. Inflation is a real concern for a lot of people still. And as a result, Americans unsurprisingly remain somewhat anxious about the economy overall. That's despite the fact that inflation measures, reported job measures, things like that are relatively stable right now. It's not to say they're good or bad, but they are stable. And it seems that these measures at this point are somewhat divorced from people's perceptions of the economy. So there's a persistent sense of unease. And that divorce between what the measures say and what people feel is even more pronounced if you zoom in on younger Americans. So back in late 2024, consumer confidence surged among Americans under 35 after President Trump's win in the election. But then in the months since, it's steadily trended downward, and at this point, it's diverged from older age groups for Americans under 35. There are a lot of factors that might be contributing to this. Partisanship, rising unemployment rates for college graduates, the threat of AI taking away jobs, or maybe in some cases, AI actively displacing or taking jobs. But regardless of the root cause or causes, the reason we're highlighting this is that it's just something to keep an eye on. It's the kind of thing that if it's not raising alarm bells yet for policymakers and business leaders, it's probably something that will in the future, in the near future, if the trend continues. And then pivoting away from consumers and towards Main Street for a minute, we want to take a look at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce MetLife Small Business Index. So it's fielded among small business owners specifically. And that same phenomenon that we see with consumers, we see with small business owners as well. They're slightly more optimistic, in this case about things like their business health and their cash flow and the US economy overall. And that's contributing to this index being slightly up right now compared to earlier this year. But once again, it's down year over year. It's down compared to this time last year. And their future expectations are mixed. So an example of this is the fact that the number of businesses that expect to increase revenue is stable from last quarter, but also down compared to this time last year. So now moving back towards consumers, let's dive into tariffs. Tariffs are, one of the reasons for this unease we're talking about, these uneasy future expectations or perhaps cynicism among consumers is tariffs. It is the elephant in the room. They loom large in the mind of the American public still, and that's really because they're seen as inflationary, at least in the short term, because people expect prices to go up as a direct result of them. You can see here that breaking it down by different types of goods and whether people expect price increases in the next 6 months. Everything from personal electronics and phones, to cars, to daily purchases, to household appliances, to fresh produce, have 7 in 10 or more Americans thinking that prices will increase. And that near-term concern that we're seeing, it's held steadily between March and July of this year, with a little over half of Americans feeling that increasing tariffs on imported goods will do more harm than good, and then conversely, about 4 in 10 feeling that President Trump's moves to shake up the economy will pay off in the long run. So there is this, what this tells you is that there is a substantial portion of Americans that feel that they will pay off, because Donald Trump's moves to shake up the economy obviously encompass tariffs. They're a big part of it. But at the same time, there is a slight cynicism with a majority feeling that they will do more harm than good. That being said, despite that slight cynicism, a majority of Americans also see potential for long-term benefits. Things like more goods being manufactured in the U.S. as a result of tariffs on foreign goods, more manufacturing jobs for Americans. These were really the promises that President Trump sold voters on regarding tariffs, that tariffs were presented as a tool to revitalize the American manufacturing sector. And a majority of Americans do feel that tariffs will lead to these outcomes. There's obviously partisanship on display here, but it's notable that about a quarter of Democrats, or a little over a quarter of Democrats, agree that they'll lead to these benefits of more domestic manufacturing or domestic manufacturing jobs. That's nothing to scoff at. But on this question of whether or not the short-term pain resulted in long-term gain, basically, is it worth it? The partisanship is even clearer, and about Americans are more divided, with about half agreeing with that statement that it's short-term pain, long-term gain. So all this economic data, it can be a bit overwhelming. So to tie it all together, we want to zoom out for a minute and share some data from a recent Ipsos report about the future of the American dream. Really, to understand everything that's happening in America, it helps to understand the American dream, perceptions of it. And this research showed that it remains a largely shared set of ideas around things like opportunity, fairness, success, freedom. And one such shared idea is that, on the top of this chart, the statement, every generation should have a higher standard of living than the one that came before it. But majorities also think, moving down the list, that the American dream is harder to achieve than it used to be. They think that it needs to be more realistic, that not everybody can have everything. And there's also partisanship. So more Democrats than Republicans say that the American dream isn't attainable for someone like them. It's not a massive partisan gap, but it is a gap and worth noting. So when you consider data like this in light of everything we just saw, all the economic data we just saw, you really walk away with this sense that a lot is up in the air for Americans right now. And that's both in a concrete sense of, my own economic well-being, my family's economic well-being, but also in kind of a loftier but related sense of whether, what does the American dream mean nowadays? And is it even attainable at this point? So on that lighthearted note, we'll move on to immigration, our second to last topic. Immigration is one of the defining political fault lines in our society today. That's a point we made in our last webinar, and we continue to make it in our public releases because it's very important. There are a lot of competing and conflicting ideas around immigration, which exist in tension with one another. And Americans are actively wrestling with how to determine things like who gets to be a citizen of this country, who gets to be an American. It's a really useful lens that you can use to see the political dynamics in this current moment we're in. So starting with President Trump and his approval on this issue specifically, immigration has been an area of relative strength for the president throughout this current term that he's in, and it remains one. So his approval rating is down from earlier highs in this term. He started above water on this issue and then saw slight declines. There were ebbs and flows, but beginning in around May to June, we saw him settle into this mid to low 40s range. There's been a slight uptick in recent weeks. But the point is that despite this softening, this is better than how the president performed on this issue for most of his first term. That's really important context, that regardless of these ebbs and flows, he is above where he was from 2016 to 2020 on immigration. And then when you consider that in context of what Bernard shared earlier about how President Trump's approval ratings and potentially all presidents going forward, their approval ratings may just have a lower ceiling and higher floor, that gives you a better understanding of why approval in the low 40s on this issue could be considered an area of relative strength for President Trump. And when we say that immigration is a defining political fault line, it's partly informed by data like this. So you see the incredibly stark partisanship that just sticks out clearly. When you ask Americans whether things are headed in the right direction or are they off on the wrong track regarding immigration policy, without any explicit mention of President Trump or Republicans, Democrats are overwhelmingly negative about the direction of immigration policy, with close to 9 in 10 saying it's on the wrong track, only 6% saying it's headed in the right direction. The mirror image with Republicans, the flip side of Republicans saying that 81% saying that it's headed in the right direction, and then independents more of a mixed bag, with a little over a third saying that it's headed in the right direction, pretty closely reflecting how all Americans feel. So this is about as clear an example of partisanship as you'll find where there's just a clear line in the sand between Democrats and Republicans on immigration. So we know that there's partisan disagreement about the president's handling of immigration. We just saw the partisan disagreement about immigration policy in a broader sense. And we'll see in a minute disagreement about specific approaches to immigration, although there is some common ground to be found that we'll also talk about. What's not so controversial is whether unauthorized or illegal immigration is an issue that needs to be addressed. You can see here that about over 6 in 10 Americans agree that say that it is a concern for them. There's partisanship, but that gap isn't as wide as you see on a lot of other questions related to immigration. So about 82% of Republicans say they're concerned, and then about half of Democrats say they're concerned, and about 66% of independents. So for most Americans, what this tells you is that the question is not whether unauthorized or illegal immigration is a serious issue that needs to be addressed, it's how do you address it? And when you ask Americans about statements that reflect varying viewpoints and approaches to immigration, there are sort of two main narratives that jump off the page. The first is that in some aspects, Americans are in agreement across partisan lines about some things, like looking at the left-hand side, the idea that immigration policy should prioritize deporting unauthorized immigrants who are violent criminals. And then in terms of a broadly unpopular idea where there's consensus, things like the prioritization of deporting unauthorized immigrants who hold jobs that citizens want, or that immigration enforcement arrests should be carried out like military operations. For those unpopular ideas, broadly unpopular ideas, there is more partisanship than the focus on violent criminals. But this shows you that we're not entirely divided, and that there is common ground, even on an issue like immigration, where it very much is of the fault line that we've been emphasizing. So when it comes to deportation, where you find that consensus is the focus on criminality or violent criminality. And we see that in this question, but we've seen it in lots of other data as well. Whereas the more widespread, all-encompassing, bolder or harsher crackdown, however you want to look at it, those types of policies and proposals, that's where there's a lot more polarization. And partisanship also emerges when you ask Americans how they view the current administration's approach to immigration. So 81% of Democrats and only 16% of Republicans say that President Trump has gone too far with arrests at places of work, while 78% of Republicans and only 14% of Democrats agree that violent criminals have been the main focus of the Trump administration's enforcement arrests and deportations. So what you see is, if you look at that, the right-hand chart, the right-hand data versus the left-hand data, this gap between the hypothetical common ground, what should we do? What should be the focus? In this case, a focus on deportation of violent criminals, and this more immediate, compared to this more immediate real-world sense of what does immigration policy actually look like right now? That's where the partisanship emerges. And that kind of gap is a pattern that we see on many issues outside of just immigration, including in some cases, the area of public health, which is our last topic that Mallory is going to take us through now.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Yeah, let's switch gears. So when we last spoke about some of our public health data in our June webinar, we had indicated that public health was another area where there seems to be kind of shifting sands, right? I think we have all observed in through what we've heard in stories and seen in other public opinion data that as there have been leadership changes at institutions like the CDC, that comes with taking a different direction on policies, right? And prioritizing different issues or even, shrinking the size and footprint of these institutions, right? And I think that has some impact on the data that you'll see about trust in these institutions and the information that Americans are receiving about public health. But it also, I think, connects to, some of the broader questions around the Make America Healthy Again movement, right? I think that is another example of something that is sort of portrayed in our society today as highly polarizing, right? And there's a lot of difference in perceptions of actors sort of tied to the MAHA movement and the movement itself. But I think when you kind of strip away the political rhetoric and you look at sort of topics that might be connected, like food safety or the role that government should play when it comes to regulating the foods that Americans eat, there is actually a lot of commonality. So today I want to start by specifically focusing on food safety and kind of maybe how it connects to these underlying philosophies. But to start, I want to showcase just where we're at. This is data from our Axios Ipsos American Health Index that we've asked the American public for the past 2.5 years, what's the #1 threat to American public health at the moment? And it does tend to fluctuate a little bit. In the past, we've seen opioids and fentanyl, sort of illegal drug abuse and overdoses at the top, followed closely by obesity. With the introduction of mental health issues about 1.5 years ago, mental health kind of occupied sort of that crowded second tier. But one thing that we have seen in our most recent data is actually a rise or a renewed concern of obesity. And I think, sort of regardless of the root causes behind this shift around the top public health concerns, we'll see in some of the next slides that I have to show you that there is clearly significant concern among the American public around food, around the quality of food we eat, additives in foods. And I think you could potentially make the linkage between concerns with obesity as well as the foods that we're consuming as well. So if you look at the next slide, and as I mentioned, all of this data is public and available on our website. A lot of this public health data is actually, you can find it on our website as one of our newest data drops that was just released late last week. Really just a kind of a dive into one particular topic, but in a quick sort of 2 to 3 minute, here are the need to know facts. So I'd encourage you to check that out if this is an area of interest to you. But kind of when you look at different things that Americans could consider a risk to their health and well-being, you can see from this list, it's a pretty wide spectrum, right? From chemicals and additives in foods to air and water pollution to respiratory viruses, flu, COVID, etc. But focusing in on the food aspect, it's clear that unsafe additives in foods or chemicals in our foods is one of the top perceived health risks today. So currently, half of Americans feel that additives in foods pose a moderate or large risk to their health and well-being. That's the bar all the way on the left. 1 in 4 Americans consider it a large risk to their health right now. Food dyes, so eating or drinking things with food dyes in them, is a little bit less of a concern. We see roughly 2 in 5 Americans say that that poses at least a moderate risk to their health. But it is noteworthy that it's a pretty small number, just about 14% think that they pose no risk. So there's kind of at least, a sense that maybe they are taking on some risk depending on, what we consume. Obviously these are some of the foundational issues for the MAHA movement. So I think it's useful to see how the wider public thinks about them, and that some of these cornerstones are in touch with kind of how the general public thinks. So in the same data in our American Health Index, we also ask people about trust in institutions, and trust in recommendations from institutions like the FDA. I'll touch on this again, but going back to sort of the need to understand this current landscape that we're in. I mentioned this at the very beginning. We know that we are in an era where there is a continued erosion of trust in institutions, and frankly, in interpersonal trust as well. And I want to draw your attention here to this third bar from the top. 2 in 3 Americans say that I don't think foods that contain pesticides or food dyes are safe to eat, even if they're approved by the FDA. So there is a little bit of a hesitation that even if a government agency that oversees some of these things says something is safe, 2 in 3 Americans have a little bit of hesitation about that. And pushing further, roughly half of Americans say that they trust the current food safety standards set by the federal government. And so I think there is just an inherent level of distrust and concern about the food that we're eating. Now, that being said, just because there is some distrust in the institutions and the food that we are eating, right? That's not to say that the American public doesn't want government involvement here. Actually, it's quite the opposite. 87% of Americans, there is broad agreement here, feel that the government should be doing more to make sure that our food is safe, such as updating nutritional guidelines, adding labels to foods with artificial dyes, or reducing exposure to pesticides. And again, there is a sense that this is a little bit of a minefield right now, and it's hard for Americans to unpack this. 9 in 10 think that it should be easier for the average American to understand food safety guidelines. So I think there very much is a role for government to play here, even if we are seeing kind of a little bit of hesitation around current guidelines that these institutions are setting. So if you go on the next slide, again, just to underscore that point, more than any other health-related function that we ask about in our survey, food safety inspections are the one that Americans most want to see strengthened. So here we've asked, do you think that various health-related functions of the US government should be strengthened, kept as is, weakened, or eliminated altogether? And we see that the vast majority of Americans, 93%, think that the US government's capacity for food safety inspections should be at least kept as is, if not strengthened. And look at the dark blue on this slide. A strong majority fall into that strengthened camp, right? So more needs to be done. This is more than the percentage that's in favor of either maintaining or strengthening Medicaid, the CDC, or the Affordable Care Act. Food safety inspections and the feeling that we need to strengthen them is pretty widespread and popular with Americans, regardless of demographic, regardless of party affiliation. Here we're showing it by age, because I also think it's noteworthy that while strengthening the government's capacity to inspect the food we eat is popular across the board, it is really felt particularly strongly by older Americans, those 65 and over. They're practically unanimous in thinking that food safety inspection functions should be strengthened or kept as is. So I feel like there's been a lot of talk when we talk about the Make America Healthy Again movement, or when we talk about specific provisions, because again, public health, much like immigration, much like what Dan talked about, I think this is a case where when you actually get into kind of specific provisions, right, you do see that there is agreement among the public, and there is nuance that's here. That being said, I think it is worth noting that around this issue, there has been a lot of focus on the perceptions of women and really the feelings of moms as well. And there's good reason for that. Our data shows that, women in general tend to be a little bit more concerned about food safety, but mothers of children under 18 are far and away the group that is as most worried and that this is most top of mind for. So for example, if you look kind of 4 over from the left, our moms of kids under 18, 3 out of 4 moms think that chemicals or unsafe additives in foods present a moderate or large risk to their health, putting them 20 percentage points above the general public on that, but also about 25 percentage points above dads of children, right, under 18. And there's a significant difference between moms and women who don't have kids under 18 in the home as well. This is a topic where life stage really does inform your opinions. It is, I think if we were to just look at pure partisanship, that would only tell us one part of the story. Between age, between gender, parental status, and the intersection of all of these things. Certainly food safety is an area where there is kind of consensus to be found, but life stage does play an important role here, and that's particularly true if you're someone who has a young child in the home, and if you are a mother. So I did mention that there are areas of common ground here. One of those is going back to what I showed a couple slides ago, that 87% of Americans believe that the government should do more to make sure that our food is safe. There is bipartisan agreement here. 86% of Republicans, 88% of Democrats, 87% of independents agree that this is the case, that the government should be doing more by updating nutritional guidelines, adding labels, etc. And so there is pretty widespread agreement, despite the fact, as I mentioned, that there is divergent trust in the institutions that would actually be responsible for implementing some of these policies. So for example, overall, we see that a bare majority of Americans, 55%, have either a great deal or a fair amount of trust in information on health topics from the FDA. 74% of Democrats say that they trust information from the FDA, compared to 44% of Republicans. So there's a 30 percentage point gap. Again, I think in the same pattern that we called out related to immigration, these partisan divides emerge and I think are even more prominent when you're talking about perceptions of institutions and perceptions of government actors that are sort of responsible for implementing the specific policies. So think about it like this, kind of the end goal for a policy or issue might be broadly the same, right? We can all agree that more should be done to sort of keep our food safer, to maybe put labels on things or update nutritional guidelines. But when it comes to questions of who will carry out the policy or the action, or how does that actually look in practice, that's where we still see these significant partisan divides. Now, switching gears away from food, I did want to touch on vaccination. This is kind of another topic under the broad MAHA umbrella. And one thing that we have seen in recent months is we have seen a slight erosion in agreement to follow the CDC's recommended child immunization schedules. So still, I want to kind of say you can see clearly from this chart that overall, a strong majority of Americans agree that parents should follow the CDC's recommended child immunization schedules for getting their children vaccinated. 3 and 4 currently agree with that. But what I want to draw your attention to is this dark green bar. And compared, if we look at June compared to just 3 months before, February, we see an 11 percentage point difference in those that strongly agree with this. And I think it's important to know that we know from some of our other data that the public is also divided on COVID vaccine recommendations for adults and for specific groups within the population. This is something that we've seen consistently since the pandemic, was that there's sort of a lingering distrust and suspicion around federal guidance related to vaccines. We certainly saw a pattern in COVID where initially there was kind of a agreement across partisan lines about a vaccine and getting it in the hands of people that need it. And then it became rapidly politicized. And I think we're seeing this here now when it comes to whether or not parents should follow the CDC's recommended child immunization schedules. I do want to note that we asked about this in June, which is right around the time where, the guidelines themselves were changing. And so I think that could be contributing to some of that. I'll skip through this pretty briefly because I know we're just about at time. I think one thing that we've also seen when it comes to health is that Americans feel like they don't really have a good line of sight when it comes to the health of our elected officials. A majority feel that we receive too little information about the health of our members of Congress, of Supreme Court justices. About half say the same for the current president. We can go to the next slide. And finally, I think because of that, and because we are also in this area of kind of diminishing trust in our institutions and elected officials, we are also seeing broad support, 8 in 10 Americans feeling that there should be age limits in place for all federally elected officials and for Supreme Court justices. So a little non-Maha teaser for you. We can skip ahead here to the end slide because we do have a few questions that I want to take. But again, here, I just want to point out that Ipsos does have a toolkit to kind of help our clients and help people dig a little deeper in how they navigate this current landscape that we're in, right? Where words matter more than ever, where distrust in institutions is widespread, and where there is a lot of nuance, right? We can't just say that Team Red and Team Blue are wide apart on immigration or public health, because that doesn't really tell the full story here. So there's a link at the bottom if you want to learn more. There's a lot of resources that we have for you, and we will also share this deck and all of the data with registrants after the webinar today. So we have a few questions here that I wanted to cover. So first, we seeing an Epstein factor in Trump's approval ratings? I think that's a really interesting question. It's certainly one that I think we do need to kind of take a wait and see approach. What I can say in short answer is no, right? We have not yet seen it. But I do think that the Epstein issue is a potential negative anchor for the president. President Trump has this very strong populist anti-establishment brand, right? That the system is broken, that it's rigged to favor the rich and powerful and the elites. And I think this kind of anti-establishment sentiment has come into direct odds with feelings we know from our data that this is sort of an orchestrated cover-up by elites. We also know that a strong majority of Americans believe that the administration has concealed some of the details around the Epstein case. And so far, it hasn't materially damaged the president's approval ratings, but I think this is one that we need to keep an eye on, because if the president continues to be at odds with part of his base, we may not, that's where we may start to see a little bit of a shift. I'm not quite sure what issue this was referring to, but it said, instead of looking at Republicans, have you looked at the data by Trump voters versus Harris voters? I think generally speaking, we see similar patterns emerge, because political party affiliation is so closely entrenched in so many people's beliefs that whether you're asking about vote choice or whether you're asking about party affiliation, they tend to track pretty closely together these days. All right, and if we weren't able to get to your question today, we will follow up over email. I want to thank you all for joining us for the latest edition of our Know the New America Public Opinion Update. I know we covered a lot of data today. Thanks for hanging in there with us. Stay tuned for our next webinar, which will be in mid-October, I believe October 16th, and we'll bring you all of the latest in Ipsos data and what it means for the current landscape. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.